Okay, so the narrative of Ivan's life and times. Before going into the detailed events, let me just read a framing paragraph and sentence or two from Sergei Bogatyev's chapter on Ivan IV in the Cambridge History of Russia, Volume 1, from early Rus to 1689. And Sergei Bogatyev is a Russian historian. I think he works at the University College of London. He's a bit of a specialist on Ivan the Terrible and the actual realities of how the institutions of power sort of worked around Ivan the Terrible, and has over recent years started to sort of take away a little bit of some of the ideological, sort of Anglo-American ideological sort of carapace that hangs over still the interpretation of Ivan the Terrible. So this is a bit of a framing comment to help you follow the extraordinary set of events, which we'll cover with a little bit more colour and life. So Bogatyev writes, one of the longest reigns in Russian history, the rule of Ivan IV was a period of ambitious political, military and cultural projects. The ruling family sought to utilize all the material and human resources of the realm to strengthen in political power and to integrate territories with diverse cultural and economic traditions into a single state. These aims did not always complement each other. As a result of integration, the Muscovite state became increasingly complex, both socially and politically. This in turn put the dynasty under pressure from various forces operating in the centre, in the provinces and on the international arena. As the leader of the dynasty, Ivan responded decisively to the challenges of integration, though his reaction was often erratic and inconsistent. So that's the first paragraph from Bogatyev's sort of quite authoritative chapter on Ivan IV. And his final concluding remarks are that Ivan left to his successors a devastated but coherent state that retained its territorial integrity even in spite of the stormy events of the time of troubles. As a result of Ivan's rule, Muscovy became a self-sufficient polity at an immensely high price. So there's good and there's bad, and perhaps what's lacking in that account is just the spectacular human psychodrama of Ivan's life, but we'll get enough of that in the following details. But if I just say one more thing about Bogatyev's thing that might help relate it to common understanding. So if we think about Henry VIII, and to some degree Elizabeth I, but particularly Henry VIII, he's a central figure in English history. He's an iconic figure in English history. He's also a pretty wicked man. He, as we know, he had 6 wives and he killed a number of them, beheaded a number of them on pretty petty grounds about them displeasing him in one way or the other. He broke off from the Catholic Church and was, also pretty vicious towards some of his key advisors. And he's a near contemporary to Ivan the Terrible, but he was also encountering some of these similar tensions. He sort of looted, and as part of his takeover, he made himself head of the Church of England. He took over all the monasteries, he looted all the monasteries, he sort of was pretty nasty to a lot of the Catholic priests, and began an era of some pretty dark persecution and terror of Catholics in England. Not exactly a reign of free speech, and this continues on into the Elizabethan era. So there's some of those same forces of states and dynasties growing in their power and their assertiveness and asserting their power over other institutions within the society, whether they're aristocrats and barons and lords, or whether they're the church, and getting more powerful with taxation, with new military technologies, and the sort of greater capacity to acquire and control territories beyond more narrow sort of medieval confines. In many ways, that's partly what I mean by Ivan the Terrible being not so different to other European Renaissance princes. So if we just open our eyes a little bit from the sort of black legend of Russian history and look at the situation that and the individuals that are in this situation more openly, we might see some of those similar tensions, similar dynamics. Okay, on with the narrative. So in a way, the story kind of begins way back in 1380, where there is a famous battle in Russia, the Battle of Kulikovo, which effectively ends the Mongol yoke. And I'll talk about what the Mongol Tatar yoke was, but it was effectively a period of several hundred years where the Mongol Empire, the Golden Horde, effectively exercised dominion over all the various Russian principalities. In the 1200s, at some point, they came in and destroyed Kiev, and there was a sort of modus vivendi between the Russian princes and the Mongol, or the Mongol empire, around local control, as long as they paid tribute back to the Mongols. But there were regular raids and all that sort of stuff. So in the late 1300s, these Russian principalities, which are all quite sort of small, sort of throw off the Mongol yoke and start to become independent states, but they're all a little bit small and suboptimal. So over the next century or so, there is this sort of process of amalgamation, let's say, of these sort of small and non-viable local governments into a more coherent state. And then in 1437, and again these are important background events, in 1437 there's a Council of Florence where the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, in the context of the Ottoman sort of empire, banging on the doors of Constantinople, threatening to finally take over this ancient Christian city, they have a special council to try to heal the schism between the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. And there's a Russian priest who says, yeah, okay, we agree. But the Russian Tsar, or the Muscovite Tsar, says, no way, you did not have the authority to negotiate that, and basically exiles and punishes the priest, and the church retains its Orthodox Catholic faith. Now that set of events was the key thing that Antonio Posavino didn't bother to get his facts straight on when he had his discussion with Ivan the Terrible, which was why his discussion did not go so well. Then in 1453, Constantinople falls. So the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire, finally, after whatever it is, 2,000 years, collapses. And the centre of gravity of the Christian Orthodox world moves towards Moscow, because Islam is now in control of what we now think of as Greece and Turkey and even, parts of Hungary and Ukraine. Between 1478 and 1520, the Principality of Muscovy, the central state which is on the crossroads of some big rivers and trade routes, gradually gains control of the other main sort of, fragmented local governments, fragmented appanage principalities: Novgorod, Tver, Pskov, Smolensk, and Ryazan. And at the same time, of course, the Reformation is happening in Europe. Europe is descending into, ideological, cultural war and social unrest and institutional corruption and all the rest of it. So Europe is not exactly, a shining West European Christianity is not exactly a shining light of hope and wonder at this point. And in the 1520s is when Ivan the Terrible is born. In fact, it was 1530 that Ivan the Terrible was born, and at the age of 3, he becomes Grand Prince of Muscovy, the then title, as well as various other principalities. His long list of titles is a little bit long to read. Just to call him the Prince of Muscovy is also just a little bit misleading. He is suddenly the head of Russia, although he is 3 years old. So obviously someone has to stand in his stead as regent, and that regent is his mother, Yelena Glinskaya, who for the next 5 years operates as regent. And so she's kind of de facto ruler of Russia at this point. But there are all those forces of disintegration that Sergei Bogatyrov was talking about, all that intrigue and tension within the court, leading families wanting to have control, and perhaps probably also some level of resistance at rule by a woman, although of course it was not entirely unknown in the 16th century. But in 1538, Yelena Glinskaya dies, and I think certainly Ivan the Terrible always believed that his mother was poisoned. I think there might be research on that, but I'm not entirely sure. I can't remember what it is. And not only that, but Ivan the Terrible's governess, I guess his carer, his de facto carer, was stolen away from, like literally, kind of grabbed by the sort of guards of the newly installed Boyar clan that was operating in his stead. So at this point, Ivan is a bare 8 years old, and his mother's been ripped away from him. His principal carer has been ripped away from him. He has barely any sort of knowledge of his father, and he is in a nest of vipers. He harbored the resentment about this for a long time. And I can actually read from a letter that Ivan wrote in later life to Andrei Kurbsky, that letter that has been relied upon really for many biographies of that Edward Keenan disputed the authenticity of, but now most historians accept as valid because it's written in a very unique and forceful style that they find in other diplomatic letters. So there is quite a bit of evidence to suggest it is genuinely Ivan's. And he says, "Me and my brother George, of blessed memory, they brought up like vagrants and children of the poorest. What have I not suffered for want of garments and food, and all that against my will, and as did not become my extreme youth? I shall mention just one thing. Once in my childhood we were playing, and Prince Ivan Vasilievich Shusky, and yes, that is the same Shusky family that got a mention in the episode on the Time of Troubles, was sitting on a bench leaning with his elbow against our father's bed and even putting his foot upon it. He treated us not as a parent but as a master. Who could bear such presumption? How can I recount all the miseries which I have suffered in my youth? But survive he does, and at the age of 17 he is crowned Tsar, and then he gets his revenge on the Shuskis. And in some accounts, even at this point, there are accounts of Ivan doing cruel and nasty things, kind of something a little bit like Joffrey in Game of Thrones, but whether they are true or just the typical kind of tropes about wild, violent adolescent boys, we can't entirely know. And then for the next decade or so, there's a period where Ivan is quite effective as a ruler. And there's various speculation about all of this, whether he was influenced by particular councillors, particular advisors or not. And there's a lot of complicated historiographical debate around it. But in this first period, up to approximately 1560 or so, Ivan does lots of good things. He does a whole series of, I guess, what you could call social and domestic economic reform or policy reform. He introduces a new law code in 1555. In 1551, there's a very important church council called the Stolglav, the 100 Rules. And he also has a series of military victories. So importantly, in 1552, he conquers the southern city previously controlled by the sort of Tatar Golden Horde Kazan. And in celebration of that victory, that is the reason for the construction of St. Basil's Cathedral, which is named after the intercession. Its popular name is St. Basil's, after a holy fool, sort of a kind of a mendicant, wise. A holy fool is a particular kind of cultural tradition of a religious hermit wanderer and truth teller in Russian culture, but it's popularly named after Basil, who sort of practiced around there, but its actual name is named after the intercession of the Blessed Virgin, who assisted Ivan to win the Battle of Kazan. And then in 1556, he also conquers Astrakhan, the sort of southern city, which I think is on the sort of the gateway to the Caspian Sea. So he's extending the territory of Russia. And then in 1553, Ivan kind of gets a really bad illness. So bad that he appears to be on his deathbed. And I should say, by this stage, Ivan has married Anastasia Romanova and had his first child with Anastasia Romanova. So he's also concerned to secure the succession of his son, and given his own experience of being a bit mistreated as a young impotent prince, he was perhaps rather anxious about it. In any case, during this period of illness, there is a dynastic crisis where quite a few people refuse to pledge loyalty to Ivan's preferred successor, his son, in the case of him dying, and Ivan does not respond well to all of this. Yet, miraculously perhaps, the illness subsided, and perhaps the ill-judged and foolish recalcitrance of the various ruling or aristocratic families who did not want to pledge loyalty to Ivan caused a few issues for them, because they were now Ivan's sworn enemies. And then in 1558, Ivan, perhaps encouraged by his successes in Kazan, into the south, in Kazan and Astrakhan, dealing with the Ottomans and the Crimean Tatars, who were a real threat to these Russian states, would often raid and capture people for slavery and that sort of thing. In 1558, he starts a war in Livonia, so I guess what we'd now think of as the Baltic states. And this war ends up continuing almost to the end of Ivan's reign, 1583. In fact, it is the war that Antonio Posavino, who started our podcast, helped negotiate a peace to. So a very long war that ends up draining the economic resources of Russia, social resources, political authority, and all the rest of it of Russia. It's one of the key reasons, even though there were some successes and, like Smolensk, some of the areas like Narva and the sort of access to the Baltic Sea were successes for Ivan during this war. Ultimately, it becomes a bit of a difficult and complex one, and also one where perhaps the Russian military technology is not quite up to scratch with the sort of Polish, Lithuanian, kind of Central European military technology that through the 16th century, the whole gunpowder revolution and changes in military tactics and all that sort of stuff is changing the face of warfare. Then a catastrophic personal event happens for Ivan in 1560. His wife Anastasia dies. Again, speculation about poisoning. Ivan, perhaps, again, with a suspicious mind, thinks there is poisoning, but it sort of sends him mad. Let's say he actually gets married pretty soon after, but then engages in reportedly at least, engages in pretty wild debauched practices, including sort of practice, like non-Christian sort of religious practices almost. And his perhaps latent mental health problems, which I perhaps get to more in the second episode, come out. Then in 1563, another important moderating influence on Ivan, and often people felt that the relationship with Anastasia, her character, the stability in his life, perhaps the emotional support for what must have been a pretty traumatized young man, gave a stability to this early era of successful institutional reform in Ivan's rule. But then another person who was considered a significant influence on that, the head of the Russian Church, the Metropolitan Macquarie, dies in 1563. And in the years after, from 1564, that is when these famous letters from Ivan to Kurbsky are sort of being written. And through this time, there are more plots and strange actions. There's particular princes who seem to want to deal with the Lithuanian enemies of Ivan in his war in Livonia. The war has been going on for several years now, and some of the boyars are thinking perhaps they should jump ship. Boyars is the sort of Russian term for, I guess, lord or sort of aristocrat, leading figures in the court. And then in 1565, Ivan makes the fateful decision to set up the oprichnina. And this will operate for 7 years, and it is at the heart of the sort of reign of terror and of Ivan's rule. And in a way, there are these sort of, I guess, free phases of Ivan's life and or of his, free main phases of his adult period as Tsar. There's this early era of kind of stability and reform. Then there's the instability that is perhaps precipitated by the death of Anastasia and psychological events, as well as political, social tensions and difficulties in the war. That leads to him setting up this remarkable institution, the oprichnina, which goes to 1572, and then there's the sort of era after that.